What are some of the root causes of inflammation, and how can this be measured quantitatively with lab testing?
Yeah. So when we look at root causes of chronic inflammation, one, and this is what you're really addressing in this summit, is a diet and lifestyle that is not right, right? So high blood sugar and insulin resistance is primarily driven by the food that we're consuming and lack of exercise, right? Lack of movement, food that we're consuming. Obviously, stress plays a role. So high stress, poor sleep hygiene, and poor sleep quality. Sleep quality is super important. We got to make sure we're sleeping really well when we are sleeping, but also proper hygiene when it comes to sleep. That plays a big role with our sleep quality. For example, shift workers, they might sleep 8 or 9 hours, but because they're sleeping at the wrong hours that are not right with, humans' natural circadian rhythm, where we're supposed to be sleeping at night, they tend to have higher levels of blood sugar and insulin resistance compared to people that are sleeping the same amount of hours and working kind of a normal shift and then sleeping overnight. So those are major factors. And then beyond that, we have things like chronic infections. So we know that when we have different infections, whether it's a candida overgrowth in our gut, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, H. pylori infections in our stomach, parasite infections, Lyme disease, things like that, that all drives up inflammatory processes in our body. Chronic overload of toxicity. All of us are exposed to chemicals in our air, water, and food. So all of us have levels of toxicity coming into our system. But if our drainage and detoxification pathways are working properly, we should be eliminating a good amount of those and keeping our toxic bucket under control, right? And so we all have kind of like a toxic threshold. And so if we keep things under that threshold by keeping, by limiting our exposure to toxins, and then by allowing our body to detox and drain effectively, then, that doesn't drive inflammation. However, if we're consuming lots of toxins from the food we eat, the air we breathe, the things we're putting on our skin, the water we're drinking, and then we're not doing things to help improve our lymphatic system, our liver, our gut, our kidneys, right? We're not peeing, we should be, urinating, right? We should be peeing out toxins. We should be breathing them out. So respiration, perspiration, that's sweating, urination, and defecation, right? So we should be peeing, pooping, breathing, and sweating out these toxins. If we're not doing that, then our toxic load goes up, goes over that threshold, drives inflammation in the body. So toxicity is a big factor. I mentioned stress. There can also be things like post-traumatic stress disorders, right? So where somebody's had major trauma and their body never really recovered from that trauma, and they're kind of reliving that trauma. Maybe somebody that was a war veteran, or perhaps they were sexually abused or something along those lines, right? They may relive those traumas on a regular basis, driving up inflammation in the body. So all of these things need to be addressed and considered. Somebody might be living in a mold toxic house, right? And breathing in mold and mycotoxins on a daily basis. They're trying to live a healthy lifestyle, but they're constantly overloading their system with toxins. And so we've got to be able to look at all of those factors and make sure that we're addressing those to keep inflammation under control. Now, when we're measuring inflammation on labs, there's some easy labs that we can look at, you can get done on blood work. For example, one of the most common is high sensitivity C-reactive protein. CRP is a protein that our immune system produces in response to inflammation. And, so long as you don't get a false negative, like if you work out really intensely right before you get your blood test done, your CRP will be through the roof. That's actually a healthy level of inflammation, because after we exercise, we have inflammation to help our body heal and recover. So normally you want to not work out roughly 48 hours before getting the test done, ideally at least 24 hours so you get the right measurement. And your HSCRP should ideally be under 1 and really as close to 0 as possible. And so typically it's not flagged high unless it's up over 2 or 3, somewhere in that range. But anything over 1 is a sign that there's underlying inflammation there. And that's something that we definitely want to look at and address. So that's a big factor. I know in this summit, I'm sure you've got people talking about things like hemoglobin A1C. We know hemoglobin A1C, that's a sign of the glycation process, or basically when a sugar molecule binds to a major protein, like in this case, when it binds to hemoglobin, major protein that helps bring oxygen to the cells of the body and denatures the hemoglobin. And so it causes a sticky protein process. So we should have, ideally, like the optimal range really is is really under 5.2 on the hemoglobin, right? 5.2% under. And so typically in our society, nothing is flagged until it's up over 6, right? Up over 6%. I like to keep mine under 5, right? Right between 4.5 and 5, somewhere in that range, to make sure that my hemoglobin, my red blood cells, have great capacity to bring oxygen to the cells so I can create the cellular energy I need to really thrive. So hemoglobin A1C is a really good marker. There's another one that actually that you can test too. It's called a novel marker for systemic inflammation. It's called glyc-A, right? And so it's also a marker of glycosylation. And again, a sugar molecule binding to proteins. In this case, glyc-A looks at proteins particularly involved in the immune system. And so when that's elevated, I like to see it between 100 and 300, somewhere in that range, more closer to 100. When it's up over 300, we know that's a sign of systemic inflammation. In fact, there's some individuals that will have normal HSCRP, but will see the glyc-A elevated. And so that's a really good, it's a novel marker. They've just been doing a number of studies on that, really starting just in the last 5 years. Very interesting marker. We know, for example, statin drugs will have a cholesterol-lowering medications can have a mild anti-inflammatory effect that may bring CRP down, but they don't bring glyc-A down. Whereas a lot of lifestyle strategies that you're talking about in this summit will help bring both of those markers down. And so that's a really important thing to be looking at. Another key marker is LDH, lactate dehydrogenase, which is part of our natural energy, our glycolysis and Krebs cycle. It's kind of a Krebs cycle glycolysis intermediary enzyme. And so when that's elevated, it's a sign that there's inflammation, particularly heart tissue related, as well as liver, right? Could be related to liver. And speaking of liver enzymes are another really good marker. So when we're seeing liver enzymes like ALT, AST, GGT, when these are elevated roughly up over 25, that's a sign that there's inflammation affecting the liver cells. Okay. And then based on the ratios, for example, if ALT is real high, AST is kind of in the normal range, roughly 10 to 25 in that normal range, we know that inflammation is really affecting the liver. When AST is high and ALT is more in the normal range or a lot lower than the AST, we start thinking about that inflammation affecting muscle tissues or affecting the heart in particular. So that's a key marker for that. When GGT is real high, up over 25 again, and the AST and ALT are lower than the GGT, then we start thinking about biliary tree, gallbladder, bile ducts, that region. So it kind of helps us understand more of where that inflammation may be located. So these are just some of the markers. If you get a good, you can also look at just a lipid panel, like where you're looking at your LDL, which is considered the bad cholesterol, your triglycerides, your HDL levels. We like to see the triglyceride to HDL ratio. If there was one thing I was going to look at on a lipid panel, I think all the markers can have some importance. We can get some good clinical data from all those markers. But if there was one marker I think is most important to look at, it would be the triglyceride to HDL ratio. So how many triglycerides, which are basically free fatty acids that our body can use as an energy source that are circulating in the bloodstream, versus the high density lipoproteins, which are a carrier molecule that helps bring fats, lipids, all different types of molecules back to the liver from the cells. And so when we're looking at that ratio, we ideally should be under 2. So under 2 parts triglyceride to HDL, roughly close to 1, right? And that kind of as close to 1 as possible. 1 part triglyceride, 1 part HDL. Like to see that triglyceride level certainly under 100. Okay. And when we look at that, that is a key marker for insulin resistance and inflammation. If your triglyceride to HDL ratio is up over 2, if your HDL is under 50, triglycerides are up over 100, definitely a sign of insulin resistance and inflammation taking place in the body, as long as the test is done fasting, right? We always want to make sure with the lipid panel, definitely can be affected if we eat a meal right before we get that lab done. But that's a really key marker to look at, and helps us understand how well our body's responding to getting nutrients into the cells. So when triglycerides are real high, we're not good at burning fat for fuel. We've got all these extra fats out in the cell or outside in the bloodstream, and those fats can become denatured and cause more reactive oxygen species and drive up oxidative stress and inflammation in the system. So all very important markers to be looking at. A lot of these tests are not expensive. The Glyc-A is a little bit more pricey, but most of the other ones you can easily get from your physician. Just go in, ask for the high sensitivity C-reactive protein, lipid panel, liver enzymes, right? They'll run all of those. And then one other marker that we should look at as well is vitamin D levels, our 25-hydroxy vitamin D. A lot of research out showing that levels certainly under 30 nanograms per milliliter, where the lab will actually flag you as deficient, linked with all-cause mortality. So if you have levels under 30, your all-cause mortality, cancer, diabetes, heart disease, osteoporosis, neurodegenerative condition. We talk about any sort of chronic disease, and then dying of anything goes up, right? So it's really easy actually to bump that up. Ideally, we do it by getting in the sun. However, most of us just not getting enough sunshine. We may not be living in an area where the sun's going to impact us in a significant way to get the vitamin D. If we're up, let's say we live in Canada, we live in Maine, we live in these northern climates, it's going to be harder to get enough vitamin D from the sun. But if we are even if we are in that location, like in the summer months, trying to get as much sun on as much of your body as possible. Obviously, you don't want to burn, but outside of that, trying to get the sunshine is key. Sun offers a lot more benefits than just a vitamin D supplement. However, taking a vitamin D supplement as well can be really helpful. I usually recommend about 1,000 international units per 25 pounds of body weight taken with meals. You can do it 1 or 2 doses, depending on how much of that you need. And that will definitely get your vitamin D levels up. You want to test, every 3 to 6 months or so and kind of look at where you're at. Ideally, I like to see it up over 60 nanograms per milliliter. Usually not concerned about overdosing. The research shows that as long as you keep it really under about 150 nanograms per milliliter, you won't deal with any sort of, toxicity, vitamin D toxicity. It's really hard to get it up over 150, although it can be done if you're taking like 50,000 units every single day. So if you're taking roughly 5, 10, 15,000 units every day, you're probably going to optimize your vitamin D and do really well. And so those would be some of the key labs I would definitely recommend.